Officially recording. Hi, come on in. Glad you were there. All right, hi everybody. So welcome to Exercise Physiology. I can enlarge this a little bit. Okay. Welcome. So first day, first week going okay? Yeah? Good. Okay. Well, so we meet every Tuesday, Thursday, 10:30 to 12. I have office hours before and also after. So some of you will be in Tuesday, some of you will be in Thursday for the lab. So the lab's from 2 to 3:30. And so I have office hours from 1 to 2. And so usually after this class, I'll go down, usually have lunch, and then start getting the lab set up. So our first labs are next week, and you can plan on doing anthropometrics. Some of it will be review from Kin 106, but we do go into greater depth, especially in the calculations. So this is an upper division class. So with anthropometrics, we do things like limb length and skin folds. Hi, Jackie. So come prepared, bring a scientific calculator, and then we'll divide you into groups. I think I've already posted those groups, and we'll go through those skin fold equations. So if you've ever wondered about the history of taking skin folds and how that allows us to estimate percentage of body fat, then that's what we're going to learn about next week in lab. We'll also learn about some other measures. So most of you have probably heard of the body mass index. We will go into the fat-free mass index. And your assignment will be to look into the literature to find an article on the fat-free mass index. So not the same thing as the body mass index. So getting back to the lecture portion, office hours, other times 11 to 12, Monday and Wednesday, and then of course Tuesday and Thursday noted here. I check my email several times a day, try to provide a timely response to whatever questions you may have, so please take advantage of that. Here to help you the best I can. Our textbook is this one. So this is the 5th edition, and you're welcome to get a used book. You're welcome to get an ebook. You're welcome to pool your resources between 2 or 3 of you and get one book. But the point is you need a book. So for sure I do use the textbook. Starting on Tuesday, we'll do an assignment with chapter 1, and you'll want to have your textbook. So please plan accordingly. So in this class, we talk about how different systems of the body function and interact during exercise. So a big focus of the class is how our bodies respond in an acute sense and also in a chronic sense. So how do our bodies change over time with different types of exercise? How do the systems of the body, respiratory, circulatory, musculoskeletal, and endocrine, how do they respond and change over time with exercise? So we talk about both continuums of exercise. So we have aerobic, right? Aerobic, low intensity, relatively speaking, long duration. And then the other end of the continuum, we have the opposite. So what's the opposite of aerobic? Anaerobic. Okay, so we don't have sufficient oxygen to maintain the activity for extended duration. So short duration, high intensity. And so there's very different ways that our bodies interpret aerobic stress versus anaerobic stress. And we can see that in different types of athletes and how they're built and how they respond over time with training. So the specificity principle is definitely true. What you do is what you get. So whatever you subject the body to in terms of physical stress, that's how the body is going to change over time. So you want to think about that. We'll do lots of practical stuff in labs. How many have ever seen those elevation training masks? So I've been waiting all summer. So we have several of those, and we're going to try those out. So we're going to test blood pressure and heart rate on a cycloergometer with or without a training mask. So you can go from 3,000 feet to 18,000 feet. And so of course I adjusted it and went to 18,000 feet right away. And I lasted for about 5 minutes, and then I just had to take it off. So I think I could barely do a stretch with 18,000 feet. So let alone even walk. It was pretty stressful. So we'll maybe do 3,000 feet. So attendance is important, especially in terms of your grade. Your grade is pretty straightforward, points you earn over points possible. Those of you who were in kinesiology yesterday, so you'll get the same information. So I do take into account your effort and participation and improvement over the semester and so on. So if you're at a B+, I'd be happy to give you an A- if I could see that you've been trying and that you care about the class. So late policy, please get your assignments in on time. I know that you have lots of things going on in your lives, so lots of assignments due or exams in other classes, car breaks down, etc. Just notify me. I'm happy to give you a little more time. Okay, so communication, really important. Okay, so how do you accumulate points? We'll do lots of in-class activities. I try to plan for at least one every class period, so today is no exception. We'll have something that you can turn in for some points today. Those add up over the course of the semester, and that's why attendance is important. And then exams, 4 exams, 75 points each. The exams in this course, different from other courses, they accumulate your knowledge. So, for example, exam 1, chapters 1 and 2, okay, so that won't have any comprehensive information on it, but beginning with exam 2, you'll have specific chapters, but you'll also have a small amount of selected comprehensive concepts. So how do you know what those comprehensive concepts are? So there's study guides that are very useful to help you determine what you should focus on for not only the current material, but also for the comprehensive stuff. So we get down to the very end of the semester, and here we are, Tuesday, December 13th, and that's your final 17 and 20 plus selected comprehensive concepts. So do you have any questions at this point? Okay. All right, so well, we may as well cover some of chapter 1 then. So just a little about D2L before we get to chapter 1. So everything is organized for you here in folders. So the chapter 1 is there. Don't have any assignments in there yet. There will be some stuff, and then you can always rate's up here. So, pretty straightforward. All right, so chapter 1. Okay, so what is exercise physiology? So, definition. So, basic and applied science. So, I like the applied part. I like to be able to take all of that basic information about muscle cells and figure out how I can use it in real life. So all of you will be practitioners at some future point. So we need to talk about the application. So you're not just learning and memorizing information without being able to use it. The basic stuff is important because it's the foundation, but then we have to build the application onto that. So we talk about responses, and responses occur during, immediately following exercise. So think of exercise as a type of stress on your body. But with repeated application of that stress, we get adaptation. So changes begin to take place. And so we can measure responses and we can measure adaptations. And so it's really nice, the technology we have now, not only making it more convenient to track things like heart rate and blood lactate and blood pressure, and we've got some excellent equipment to track those things, but we also want to know how the body is changing over time. So we've got nice tools to measure those changes as well. So all of you, some of you sooner than others, will be doing a thesis as part of your capstone experience for this major. And so for your thesis, depending on your question, you'll be tracking responses. Some of you who are really motivated will be tracking adaptations. So a thesis is you discuss that with your advisor and then you come up with a plan, and that's your last, or should be about the last thing you do before graduation. So that's KIN 499. Okay, so definition of exercise. A single bout of bodily exertion, okay, or muscular activity that requires expenditure of energy. Expenditure of energy. So what's the energy molecule of the body? What's the energy currency of the body? Yeah, ATP. So we eat food and then our body breaks it down and then reassembles it traps that energy in the ATP molecule. And so we break ATP down to provide energy for exercise. Expenditure of energy above resting level, and that in most cases results in voluntary movement. Okay, so most cases, does exercise always involve movement? So what's the application? So how many of you have done planks? Lots of planks. So that's static or isometric exercise. So it's not necessarily dynamic. So exercise response. So these are things that happen during, and immediately following. So you might expect an elevation in heart rate. So some of you might know what your resting heart rate is. So first thing in the morning, open your eyes, you look at your watch, and there's your resting heart rate. So for healthy young people like you, probably maybe some of you in the high 40s, most of you probably in the 50s or maybe even low 60s. So, and we can also see what happens immediately following exercise. So think of metabolism as the sum total of all the chemical reactions that are taking place. And so if exercise requires energy expenditure above a resting level, we don't immediately revert back to a resting level of energy expenditure following a workout. So following a workout, there's a period of time where our body is adjusting back to a resting level. So for a period of time following a workout, usually about 60 minutes, but depending on the workout, the energy expenditure can be elevated a little bit for several hours. So energy expenditure following a workout can be elevated above baseline conditions. So the application is that can be very important for body composition, couldn't it? So we'll study this in chapter 4, but we call that the excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. EPOC. How many have heard that acronym, EPOC, excess post-exercise oxygen consumption? So for a period of time after a workout, we're still consuming oxygen and expending energy at an elevated rate. So guess where most of those calories come from in that EPOC state? What energy substrate do you think? Body fat. Okay? So very, very important for weight management purposes that we have this period where we can expend calories at an elevated rate. So you think about that repeatedly over the course of a week where you're getting these workouts and then this elevated expenditure as you come back down to a resting state and then you work out again. That can add up to a lot of excess calories that you're expending. So that can make a huge difference in being able to create this calorie deficit where you're going to be improving your body composition. Okay, so let's talk about this in terms of research. This study conducted a while ago, 17 years ago, 2005. So the impact of metabolic stress on hormonal responses and muscular adaptations. So I want you to notice in that title there are two words that we've already spent time talking about today. There is responses, and there's also adaptations. So here's a practical study that looked at responses during and immediately following, and then also changes over time. So this was a very interesting study. It was about resistance training. So let's take a look. There were two different types of workouts. One had very little rest between sets, and one had more rest between sets. So they were working with about a 10 rep max. So how many by the show of hands know what a 10 rep max is? So you're all, yeah, okay. So you can lift a load 10 times, but not 11, right? So moderate load. And so they tracked, the NR was little rest, the WR was longer rest. And you'll have to look back at the procedures to see exactly what that was. But they looked at acute responses. So things that are going on either during or immediately following these two different types of resistance training sessions. And so you can see with blood lactate, they looked at before the training session, and then they tracked the blood lactate response at different time points. So immediately following, so this is post 0 minutes, and then 15 minutes, and then 30 minutes. So tracking how much lactate. Lactate is an indirect measure of metabolic stress. So when our bodies are really working hard without sufficient oxygen, we've surpassed the point in intensity where things are aerobic, and now we have to rely on anaerobic energy production to get sufficient ATP. Our bodies produce lactate as a byproduct. So over the course of the post-workout period, you can see that for both types of sessions, lactate is gradually dropping, which is a good thing. So in chapter 4, we'll get into what we do with lactate. So lactate is not a waste product that maybe you've heard myths or rumors about lactate. We'll talk all about lactate and what the importance of lactate. Because after a workout, lactate is just converted back to glucose, and then we can store the glucose as glycogen. So it's useful, it's just in that temporary state as a lactate molecule. So after the workout, you can see blood lactate coming down, but if we define blood lactate as a measure of metabolic stress, which type of workout is more metabolically stressful according to these results? So you can see there, one workout involved minimal rest between sets, the other workout involved longer rest. So what we can take from that is, okay, so if you're working with a 10 rep max load and you're taking less rest between sets, and we think that blood lactate is an assessment of metabolic stress, you're going to have higher blood lactate levels at all time points post-workout. So what we can say is adjusting the rest between sets makes the workout metabolically more stressful. So from a practical standpoint, you probably already knew that if you have lots of experience, that if you're minimizing rest between sets, you get that greater stress. So growth hormone, that's another common way of assessing metabolic stress. So there tends to be a positive correlation between blood lactate and growth hormone. So growth hormone, in one sense, is a fat-burning hormone. So there's over 100 different types of growth hormone. So we call those growth hormone variants in the body. So there's lots of different versions of growth hormone. So after a workout, the version of growth hormone we get is a potent fat-burning molecule. So we could almost tie in the growth hormone response with EPOC. So what does EPOC stand for again, just to back up? What does EPOC stand for? The excess consumption. So we say excess oxygen consumption because the more oxygen we consume, the more energy we expend. So we can say, okay, well, if I design a workout that is metabolically stressful, it's probably going to have a greater growth hormone response and probably associated with a higher EPOC. So another way of thinking about EPOC that is maybe more common in the media is the afterburn effect. Metabolic afterburn is a less formal term for that. Testosterone. So testosterone, of course, is an anabolic hormone, and not much difference between conditions here. So we can also say that altering the rest between sets doesn't necessarily affect the testosterone response. So there'd be a greater response in terms of blood lactate and growth hormone with less rest versus more rest, but serum testosterone, there's really not a lot of difference between those conditions. So rather than rest interval between sets, maybe the load or the intensity has more to do with testosterone response. That's a discussion for a different day. So in terms of adaptation, so we've discussed responses. So what if you carry out a certain type of training over a longer period of time? What changes can you expect to see? So this would be, I think it was the vastus lateralis, if I remember correctly. So that's a common muscle to measure change in size because it's readily available and close to the surface and you can test it. So anybody know what CSA stands for without reading the bottom? So cross-sectional area. So that's just a fancy way of describing a change in the size of muscle. So you can see that over an extended period of time, practicing these different training methods, less rest between sets, more rest between sets, at least in this population, there was a greater percentage increase in the size of that muscle versus the longer rest, and over here the control condition. So just an example of how we can incorporate this response and adaptation. So exercise response is determined by 3 factors. The first one is exercise intensity. So exercise intensity can be described in maximal or submaximal terms. Also in absolute and relative terms. So if we look at something in absolute terms, that means everybody gets the same amount of load. Sometimes that works well, other times not so much. So let me give you an example. So the Wingate test is a 30-second all-out cycle test. We get to that just after midterm. So we have a fancy Wingate bike in the lab, and we have software where you can see your power output, how fast you're pedaling against a certain resistance. So everyone pedals against 7.5% of your body weight. So that's relative. A percentage of your body weight is a relative workload. So it wouldn't really be fair if I had everybody pedal against the same workload, because everybody has a different body weight. So what's your name? Michael. So if I asked Jackie to pedal against the resistance that Michael was pedaling against, that'd be probably too much. So we want the intensity to be the same in relative terms for everybody. So 7.5% of your body weight is apples to apples comparison. So let me just show, this is table 1.1 from your textbook. So here's 3 people. Here's their maximal lift. So you can see that in terms of a 1 rep max, whatever this lift is, that they have different levels of absolute strength. Okay, so then you take an absolute load, like 80 pounds, and you ask each of those people, how many times can you lift this 80-pound load? This is not relative, this is the same load, everybody's lifting it. So it's absolute submaximal load. It's submaximal for everybody except 2. Terry. And that's because his maximal lift is the same as the absolute workload over here. Okay. All right, so let's take 75% of their maximal lift. So 75% of 160 is 120. 75% of 100 is 75, of course. 75% of 80 is 60. So we're going to take that relative workload and ask them how many times can they lift that. And all of them in this case lifted it exactly 10 times. So if we ask everybody to lift the same absolute load, it's going to be really easy for some people and really hard for other people. But like on the Wingate test, when we equate it based on the same percentage of body weight or the same percentage of their maximal strength, we can give everyone an equal opportunity to do well. Does that make sense? So sometimes we use absolutes, other times relative. Okay, so your textbook has some guidelines in terms of intensity. There is no universal agreement on this, so this is the author's best opinion. What constitutes light, moderate, or heavy? So these are the guidelines going from 1 through 6. So lower light, less than or equal to 54% of maximum. So this could apply to aerobic or anaerobic exercise. Going all the way down where we have supramaximal, so greater than 100% of your maximum. So that would apply in some cases. Some cases we can actually go above our max with some assistance or different types of muscle actions. Okay, so the first one, exercise intensity determines the response. Exercise time, duration, or repetitions can also affect the response. So the length of time the muscular action continues, so how long are the muscles being tensed, or how long are the muscles working? Okay, the longer the duration, the lower the intensity that can be sustained. It's important that we don't equate intensity with exertion. So you can be working at a relatively low intensity, but still be exerting yourself 100%. So exertion is subjective, whereas intensity is objective. So intensity is objective. There's a number to it, a percent of your max, whereas exertion is subjective. So the amount of homeostatic disruption depends on both the duration and intensity. What does this word mean, homeostasis or homeostatic? What do you think of with that word?
Your neutral, normal, kind of.
Yeah, it's this constancy in the body's internal environment. So exercise is a form of stress. It disrupts this constancy in our internal environment across many systems, which is why we have this period of epoch where our bodies are gradually coming back down to this homeostatic state. So intensity and duration both can affect how much disruption. So the amount of disruption, that's what stimulates your body to change, right? So if we don't have very much disruption, what reason is there for your body to make changes? So in other words, we have to do something that has an overload to it, don't we? If we want to get enough disruption in our body's physiology to make a change, we have to get outside our comfort zone. So that's where the overload comes in and progression comes in, is we're applying an overload at a certain rate that allows our bodies to have this disruption so that with recovery, we reach this higher level of function. So our systems change so that when we come back and do that same workout again, it should be easier, right? And why is the workout easier over time? Has the workout itself changed? No, it's our ability to do the workout that's changed. So our ability to do a given workout depends on this adaptation process. So our bodies change to make things easier. So exercise type is the last one. So type of exercise, aerobic versus anaerobic. Muscle action is another example that would determine responses. So dynamic or static. Okay, so we're building up to a class activity. So we'll get to it in just a few minutes. There are 6 exercise categories identified in chapter 1. So you need to be familiar and be able to identify, and it's really not difficult. It's more common sense, but let's just introduce each of these. So category 1, short-term light to moderate submaximal aerobic activity. So I put the acronym ADL. Anybody know what that stands for? ADL. You've been doing it up to this point today, your activities of daily living. So everything you do in the course of your day that is active. So a few minutes to several minutes, less than or approximately 30% of maximal work capacity, a lot of times less. This is the type of activity that the Center for Disease Control is promoting with its physical activity recommendations. Encouraging people to be more active as we go about our daily routine. So this is where you hear, okay, don't take the elevator, do what? Take the stairs, okay? Park further from the building because then you walk, all those things. This is connected with some health benefits. So the lifestyle that we had 100 and 120 years ago has changed to the lifestyle we have today. How so? What do you think? What do you think Montana was like back in 1900? What did most people do for a living, you think? They did a lot more walking, I'm sure. Yeah. Railroad workers, farmers, ranchers. Okay, those are very active occupations. We don't have as much of that anymore. Okay, so we have more occupations that we are sedentary for long periods of time. Like I sit in my office for hours warming my chair, and it's important to get up and walk and be a little bit active. It's not a significant intensity like it would be with exercise, but there are health benefits with moving more during periods throughout the day. It really does make a difference. Okay, so now we get into the structured exercise. So category B, long-term moderate to heavy submaximal aerobic exercise. So this is what you would equate with traditional cardio. So ACSM, American College of Sports Medicine, recommendations for improving aerobic fitness calls for 20 to 60 minutes, 3 to 5 times a week at a certain percentage of maximal work capacity, or sometimes it's in terms of your percent heart rate or maximal oxygen uptake. So this is where our paradigm has shifted, and we're thinking about actually improving aerobic fitness. So it goes beyond just taking more steps every day into, okay, I actually want to get a better VO2 max. So what is that, VO2? I know you've heard it before. How do we define VO2? How do we define VO2? You estimated it in 106, and we'll do a fun lab. That one's getting towards Thanksgiving. So just before Thanksgiving, we'll get your VO2.
Maximum oxygen uptake.
Yes. So how much oxygen can your body take in per minute? So that's the criterion measure of VO2. That's your aerobic fitness. How much oxygen can you consume per minute, per kilogram of body mass? So people vary in that fitness characteristic. So what is a good VO2? Well, for health-related fitness, that's probably between 40 and 45 milliliters per kilogram per minute. The world record, I think, that's actually been recorded in a lab is around 93. So a Norwegian cross-country skier was measured at that. So most of your elite endurance athletes are going to be somewhere in the 70s or 80s. good college cross-country runners in the 60s and 70s and so on. So, and that makes sense because what do they spend their time doing? Activities where they're really consuming lots of oxygen. So it makes sense over time, what does their body do? Their body makes changes so that they consume more oxygen because that's what makes them good at their activity is being able to consume more oxygen. So this would be traditional structured cardio, we could say. Okay, so category C is actual VO2 testing, incremental aerobic exercise to maximum. So this is what we'll do as part of this class. The step test, the pyramid test that you took in 106 is a submaximal test. We can use submaximal tests to estimate VO2 max. In this class, we're going to directly measure VO2 max. So you'll have the indirect calorimeter and a mask that collects expired gases to determine how much oxygen your body is consuming per minute. And the test that we like to use is called the Bruce protocol. So this is a 7-stage test, includes a little bit of a warm-up phase, so you can see the speed and the grade, and the duration of these phases is 3 minutes. So looking at that, usually almost everybody does really well for the first, even the third stage. It's kind of like a nice uphill walk, but comfortable. It's a slow walk up a pretty good incline, but you're not really pushed to a significant extent. Most people, somewhere in the 4th or 5th stage, will start to be challenged and even terminate the test. So in terms of our lab, the most I've ever seen, someone did get into stage 7 one time, and that was a couple years ago. Jory, England, got into stage 7. So he was an All-American here a couple years ago in the 3,000 steeplechase, and we actually tested him about a month after he graduated, but had achieved that. We tested him a few weeks later, and he was up in this stage 7. He didn't quite get all the way through stage 7, but he was about a minute, maybe a minute and a half into stage 7 before he finally had to stop. Lots of athletes, had lots of other cross-country athletes in here that have gotten all the way through stage 5. So stage 5 would be 15 minutes, 3 minutes times 5 stages, 15 minutes. So stage 5 would be 5 miles per hour, which is kind of a slow jog, but it's really not the speed that gets you, it's the grade. So a slow jog with an 18-degree incline is really, it's pretty stressful. So, but I would say most exercise physiology students somewhere in stage 4, so somewhere between the 12th, somewhere between the 9th and the 12th minute would be stage 4. And usually most are somewhere 40 to 50 milliliters per kilogram unless you're a cross-country athlete that's an HHP major and you go a little longer. Okay, so the 4th category, static exercise. Static, sometimes called isometric. So muscles are under tension at a certain percentage of a maximal voluntary isometric contraction. So we can tense our muscles at certain levels. We can tense our muscles with maximal effort. We can tense our muscles with lesser effort, submaximal effort, but we can describe that and measure it. in terms of the force output or the torque output at a certain joint angle. So this type of exercise is often described in terms of a joint angle. So with the elbow at 90 degrees, tensing your elbow flexor muscles, how much torque did you produce? And then we would describe that as a maximal voluntary isometric contraction. So then you could then take percentages of that max. If any of you are in kinesiology, which a lot of you are, we're going to be doing electromyography this semester, and so this will come back into play because we use a maximal voluntary isometric contraction to express EMG values. So how much activity did a certain exercise elicit in a muscle relative to a maximal contraction? So some of you might be confused. So let's talk about it. Okay, so activation of the gluteus maximus with different lifts. So as I look, all of you have probably done, okay, so back squats and split squats and hip thrusts. So that's what this study looked at, is how active in terms of a percentage of maximal voluntary isometric contraction. How active is the gluteus maximus during each of these lifts with the same relative workload? Okay, so if anybody doesn't know or hasn't done, so this would be a hip thrust, and I've seen Corey put up some big numbers on the hip, 500 pounds maybe, or was it more? It was a lot. So getting back to the EMG stuff. So if any of you do your student research on EMG, you'll make a graph that looks like this. And so on the y-axis, what we've got is the activation of the gluteus maximus, and there's that acronym there, the percentage of maximal voluntary isometric contraction. And then we have each of the exercises on the x-axis. So these are percentages, so 20% of a maximal voluntary isometric contraction, 40, 60, 80, 100, 120% of a maximal voluntary isometric contraction. Okay, so we can see that hip thrust is a pretty good exercise, isn't it? For activating that gluteus maximus. The other ones are good too, but not quite as good as that one. So I hope some of you will want to do some EMG as part of your study. Maybe a different muscle though. I don't know if we could put electrodes on somebody's glute muscle. I don't know if that would get through the IRB. Apparently it did with these guys. I don't know if I want to approach that. Maybe you could do the quads or something, or hamstrings. Okay, so the other interesting part of this was the relationship between peak barbell hip thrust force. Okay, so how much force can your feet put into the ground when you're doing that lift? Does that make sense? How much force? So what they probably did is put a force platform underneath their feet. So we have a force platform. They put a force platform underneath their feet, and then that had them do their hip thrust with their feet on the force platform. And so on the y-axis here, we have peak sprint velocity. So that's how fast you are. How fast can you move your body like in a sprint? So what we see is this type of relationship, this line of best fit. Each of these dots represents a person, so it's kind of a scatter plot, but we can kind of draw a line that describes that relationship. So how would you describe that relationship? As the peak force that you can produce during a hip thrust goes up, how fast you are, or your peak speed, how fast you can move your body does what? Also goes up. So there's a positive correlation between force during a hip thrust and how fast you can sprint in meters per second. So this type of, see how the applied research is really important? We can go in and look at muscle cells under microscopes, but what does that really tell you about the practical world? That's important. The microscope stuff is important, but we also have to remember there's a human being around that muscle cell. So how can we use this information in a practical way is important. Okay, so category 5, dynamic resistance exercise. So sets and repetitions, we lift the weight, we lower the weight. That's what dynamic resistance exercise is, described in terms of a percentage or a certain repetition maximum. Okay, so the very last category, so there are 6. I kind of like categories because then you kind of can see where everything fits, how it works together. So last category, very short-term, high-intensity anaerobic exercise. So this is where you would put in your high-intensity interval training, or sometimes sprint interval training. So these are 2 popular modes of short-term high-intensity exercise. This type of exercise takes place above your maximal aerobic capacity. So this type of exercise, a repetition that you can't maintain like you can with aerobic exercise. So it's intermittent. You do a sprint or other type of activity at near max, just as hard as you can go, and then what do? You rest for a little bit. Okay, so you have maybe a few seconds or a few minutes of rest, and then you do the same thing again. So this is intermittent in how we structure it. It's not continuous like aerobic type training. Okay, so let's do something different. So I want you to take out a sheet of paper or something. You'll turn this in. This is for the participation points. And please, you can go by yourself or discuss with classmates, you know. I want you to place each of these examples into one of those 6 categories. So you may need to look back and see what those categories are. So let's just review quickly. So first one was your ADLs. So just going about your day, moving your body. Second one was your traditional cardio. Okay. Third one was your test, your VO2 testing. Fourth one was static. So look at the first 2 that I gave you. Anytime you're holding a resistance or holding a tension in the muscle. Okay, dynamic resistance exercise. And then the last one was your high intensity intervals. Take just a minute, just go through them, and please feel free to chat with each other.
Are you okay with us just writing the abbreviations for them too, like ADL, or do you want?
That's fine. It's a simple review, don't stress. So for example, what would the first two be? Yeah, good. So there's a little bit of clearing outside.
So for like the mini triathlon day, would
Mm-hmm.
you say that would be like a long term? Because that's more than the 60 minutes, but it's like its performance.
That'd be long term, yeah.
Okay.
You're the one that sends me those nice. That's a good method. Sticking out the same thesis topic for spring.
Maybe I might change it though, so it's more fitting for like the grad school plan.
Okay.
So that way it's like more applicable to that. Mine's not finished.
Okay.
So we'll see.
Keep me
If I don't
posted.
come up with something, then yeah, but
Oh, we'll get it done.
yeah.
Corey, are you doing your thesis this spring or next fall?
Next fall.
Okay. Does anybody need more time?
Just a
Okay.
little bit more.
All right. Anybody ever tried barrel racing? so first two you got static. What'd you get for number 3?
I debated it because like that could be her daily activity.
I've seen some that are running. One of those jogger strollers. So what would your first impulse be? I got short-term light to moderate on that one, submaximal, so more activity of daily living. Okay, so number 4, what'd you get?
Incremental.
Yeah, that's your testing. Any of you do the pacer test? Let's go. Okay, so number 5. So that's what we're saying, like long-term, moderate to heavy. 6.
I did like hit sit since it was.
Yeah, it's just very short-term, quick burst type of anaerobic. 7.
Dynamic
Dynamic.
resistance.
Yep. 8. Yep, long-term, moderate to heavy. 9.
Incremental.
Yep, that's you guys. 10. Your I think you burned some calories above rest sitting on a horse. I think you do. Short-term, light to moderate. And then 11. Your dynamic resistance. 12. Yep. Yep. So very short-term, high intensity, anaerobic, like that. So hang on to those. I'll ask for them at the end here. So we'll go for about 20 more minutes. Okay. So exercise response interpretation. We need to keep 4 factors in mind. Characteristics of the exerciser. So obviously people have different fitness levels. People can be really strong in one fitness characteristic and maybe not so strong in a different characteristic. So things that we measure that can represent different parts of fitness, what do we measure that would be considered fitness components? Yeah, flexibility is a fitness component, yeah. Yeah, power is a fitness component, good. We're going to be doing lots of them. VO2, okay, that's aerobic capacity. And we measure strength. And we measure muscular endurance. What's the difference between muscular endurance and cardiovascular endurance? We have 2 endurances. Cardiovascular and muscular. What's an example of a muscular endurance test?
I think maybe the one where you hold, you're like a pull-up, but you hold it.
Oh yeah, yes, the flexed arm hang.
Yeah, like you use that fitness testing.
There we have a power rack in there now. Have you seen it? Maybe we should do that one. Thanks for bringing that up. Okay, so muscular endurance versus cardiovascular endurance. What's cardiovascular endurance?
Like running.
Yeah, so it's more total body, whereas a muscle endurance test might be just targeting a limited group of your total body muscle. So muscle endurance is time or repetitions. Cardiovascular endurance is your oxygen consumption. Okay, so appropriateness of the selected exercise. So if someone is a cyclist, guess what they'll test the best on if you're giving a VO2 test? Cycling, right? Okay, so if someone's a runner, they'll test best doing a running activity for their VO2 max. So even though cycling involves your legs, running involves your legs, it involves different recruitment patterns. So different combinations of muscles that are activated in unique ways that allows VO2 to be different. So Lance Armstrong, I'm sure you've all heard of him and the allegations and controversy, etc., but still very impressive what he was able to accomplish. Soon after his last Tour de France victory, he ran a marathon. Okay, so he's an elite level cyclist. Guess how fast his marathon time was? You think it was good? It was good. 2 hours and 30 minutes. Okay, that's a good time. Is it an elite marathon time, though? No, it's not. So fitness characteristics are specific to what we do on a habitual basis. Okay, accuracy of the selected exercise. So now we're getting into validity. So how well does our exercise represent the characteristic that we're trying to measure? So criterion versus field-based tests. The criterion test is considered to be the most valid. What's the downside of criterion testing, though? How many of you have been to your local fitness center and they offer MRI scans to assess your percent body fat? So criterion testing is expensive and time consuming, but it's highly valid and accurate. Okay, so but the downside again, it's not readily available to everybody. So which is why we have field-based tests. So research is conducted so that certain field-based tests have a high correlation with a criterion test. So if you were to do a certain field-based test and come out with a certain result, and you followed all the procedures, it should be relatively close to what you would get if you had access to a criterion-based test. So we have a lot of the criterion-based methods in our lab. So a VO2 test, you want indirect calorimetry where you're actually analyzing expired gases. So you can't do that in a fitness center. So that's not readily available to the general public. So what we do instead is we do estimates of VO2. So we do like the Cooper 12-minute run, or we do the 1.5 mile run, and based on how much distance or how fast you run 1.5 miles, we're able to correlate what your VO2 would be if we were to actually test it directly in a lab, like with what we do. Okay, environmental and experimental conditions. So environmental conditions, temperature and humidity, can make a huge difference for lots of different tests. Endurance comes to mind. So most elite endurance performance takes place in a moderately cool environment with low humidity. We don't see many endurance records that are set in high temperatures with high humidity. Anybody know why, or guess why? Why don't endurance athletes do well with high temperature and high humidity outside?
Well, humidity is kind of like, people say like in the endurance, it's poor man's elevation. It's harder to breathe and harder to.
Yeah, that's right. It's tougher to cool the body. So you have a certain volume of blood, and if it's hot and humid, some of that blood has to be directed away from the muscles and to the surface of the body to allow for the cooling effect through evaporation. Whereas in a cooler environment, you have more blood going to the active muscles to deliver oxygen. So it's kind of a competition between the cooling needs of the body and the exercise needs. So endurance performances tends to be better with low humidity and moderately cool temperatures. Okay, so here's a figure from your textbook showing blood pressure response in men versus women, trained versus untrained, older older versus younger. So you can see the blue line there is the older, the red line is the younger, and then sedentary on this side, trained on this side. So what can we say about the peak systolic blood pressure response in older versus younger people, independent of activity level? What can we conclude based on? In other words, do older versus younger people have an exaggerated systolic blood pressure response to maximum exercise? Yeah, so irrespective of activity level or training status, it's very consistent. Older people tend to have a higher maximal systolic blood pressure response. So during maximal exercise, one of the things we track is systolic blood pressure. So the pressure in the arteries when the heart contracts. And during exercise, the heart is contracting more frequently. It's also contracting more forcefully. So the pressure that the blood is under inside the vessels is much higher. So we have systolic blood pressure that we would expect with an increase in heart rate. We would expect that systolic blood pressure to rise as you reach higher percentages of your VO2. You can see going from rest to 100% of VO2, you get this gradual rise in systolic blood pressure. What's the other blood pressure that we are concerned about? Diastolic. So how do we define diastolic blood pressure? The pressure of the blood when the heart is doing what? When the heart is resting, right? So between heartbeats. What's the heart doing between heartbeats? Yeah, so the heart goes through these cycles. It's called the cardiac cycle. So the heart is either working, pushing blood, or it's resting. So it fills up with blood during rest and then pushes blood. So systolic and diastolic. Over and over again throughout your life, the heart fills up and pushes, fills up and pushes. So diastolic blood pressure describes the pressure of the blood when the heart is at rest. So there's still pressure, the blood is still moving, albeit with much less pressure, because at that point the heart is filling up with more blood. So getting back to this though, diastolic we don't see much change. So if we were to see a graph showing diastolic, it would kind of be a flat line, or maybe even a slight decrease. Because the heart is resting, the blood vessels are wide open and dilated. So when the heart is resting, diastolic blood pressure is going to be much less than systolic, where the heart is pushing blood. So the other point is that with sedentary versus trained men, the response really isn't that much different. So sedentary man versus trained man, irrespective of age, older versus younger, they're about the same level at each of these percentages of VO2, all the way up. It's a little bit different with the women, that we show that there's a significant difference between sedentary and trained. So the sedentary women had a much higher systolic response in both age groups versus the trained women's systolic response was much lower, significantly lower, whereas the men, it was not much different. Okay. So we're getting into about the last half of the chapter now. How would you define training? What would you say? We could see our textbook definition, but I want you to think about it in your mind, what training means. So a consistent or chronic progression of exercise sessions. So series of exercise sessions designed to improve physiological function for better health or sports performance. So training can be directed towards better health, or it can be directed towards better performance, or maybe some combination of both. What if your goal is just good health? Is what you do, could it be different than if your goal was performance? How so? If you're just interested in, say, well, I have high blood pressure or high blood glucose or high blood cholesterol, and my goal is to get those variables down because I want to live longer and feel better, versus I want to be able to dunk a basketball.
The sports performance is going to be a lot more specific to what your goals are.
Highly specific, okay, especially as more years of training, highly specific. Whereas for health, you can walk, you can bike, you can do lots of different things. You can do yard work. All those things can contribute to changing your body to be more healthy. So let's define physical fitness then. So fitness is a product. It's what you are, not necessarily what you do. Okay, so there is a process that we can get to the product, but if we're just talking about fitness, it's a snapshot, it's a state. What is your state of fitness right now? So a state of well-being that provides the foundation for tasks of daily living. So it also provides a degree of protection against hypokinetic disease. So what does that word hypokinetic mean? Hypokinetic. What is the prefix? Anything hypo means what? Less of or more of? Less of. So it means less movement. Lack of movement. Do we have any health conditions in our society today that are due to lack of movement, or maybe could be corrected if we had a priority to move more? So we live in an interesting time in the history of the world. Lots of time sitting and being sedentary. We have lots of food that's available. So we live in a society where we see these diseases that are due to a lack of movement and overconsumption of calories. Cardiovascular disease, cancer, all those things associated with the blood lipids, blood pressure, blood cholesterol, all these things associated with hypokinetic disease, metabolic syndrome. So this is where, for the majority of population, and even you athletes, eventually you'll just be regular people at some point, health will be a concern. So our goal is to live long, happy, healthy lives. It's successfully aging. Whereas with sports performance, it's very different. We have targeted training to turn people into these superhumans that are faster and stronger and more powerful. So the way that we turn people into these superhumans is different than if you're just interested in your overall health. So this is a really neat figure from your textbook, defining exactly what components of fitness are sport specific and which components are connected with better health. So we have the core, these characteristics right in the middle, okay? Cardiovascular, respiratory endurance, or aerobic power. Very important for both performance. You can see this extends out here into the sport-specific realm as well, but in the middle, this is very important for good health. Muscular strength, muscular endurance, flexibility. This looks a little bit different, doesn't it? It has both green and blue. That's because these authors looked at the literature, and flexibility might be considered important for both. And I would agree with that. Mobility is so important for both health and good performance. Body composition. That's another one important for good health. One Ashley mentioned that would be both here would be power. Here. Okay, so this shows, this is called a dose response curve. So this is taking a concept from the medical field, the dose response. So you take a certain dose of medication, and what is the dose of medication determined by? What are some factors that would determine how much medication you take?
Body weight.
Yeah, body weight is number one. Maybe age, other confounding health variables, okay, that go into that. So there's lots of factors that go into prescription of drugs. Exercise can be likened to medicine. So we do a certain dose of exercise to get a certain response. So this is a dose response curve, relative risk of mortality with different doses of energy expenditure, so the calories that you expend per week. So first question, is this relationship linear? Does that line in that graph look linear to you, that perfectly straight line? No, it doesn't. So we can say there's a point of diminishing returns. Okay, so it's pretty linear starting off, so you get a lot more risk reduction going from, say, no movement or not many calories to about 1,500, and then notice how the curve begins to flatten out. So there's a point of diminishing returns where expenditure of additional calories doesn't reduce your risk any further. So some other graphs from your textbook. Interesting. So this would be all-cause death rate per 10,000 person years. So this is just an epidemiological, actually we did a lot of this last spring. So this is just a way of expressing mortality rate in different categories. So this category of people is considered inactive. This category of people is considered active. So how do we define inactive versus active? Well, Center for Disease Control has exercise recommendations. So you're defined as active according to the CDC if you exercise at a moderate intensity 5 days a week for 30 minutes. That's the guideline. 5 days a week, 30 minutes, you're moving your body, it's moderate intensity. You would be placed in this group over here. You'd be placed somewhere in this group. Okay? If you're not doing anything at all, if you're inactive, sedentary, you'd be placed in this group. Now, let's go within each of these groups. So within the active group, maybe you're doing the CDC recommendations of 5 days a week, 30 minutes a day, moderate intensity, but what are you doing the rest of the day? So we're dividing this into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's quintiles. So 5 groups looking at what they're doing the rest of the day. So in this group, the active group, okay, you're fulfilling the CDC guidelines, but the rest of the day, almost all of the time you're sitting. Okay, next one. As part of every day, 3/4 of the time you're sitting, and so on, almost none of the time right here. So that would be this square right here. So you'd want to be, even if you're filling the CDC guidelines, you want to try and be in these groups right here. So you're moving around a lot in addition to what you're doing for structured exercise. That's not possible for all of us. So what we can say is, if you're completely inactive versus at least getting the CDC guidelines, there's an overall reduced risk. Okay. It's really bad if you are completely sedentary, but then sitting almost all the time. That's this great big bar right here. Great big bar right here. So what can we say about going from doing nothing to doing something? Okay, so within these groups, you can see as they reduce their time sitting, so maybe they're getting up from their chair at work, walking the hall maybe a couple times every hour or so, just kind of getting up and not sitting so much. You can see the risk reduction goes down a lot. Even with the active group, okay, you're filling the CDC guidelines, but during the rest of your day, you're trying to get up and move around a little more. You can see there's also a little bit of risk reduction as well. So the overall message is, if we want to live a long time, what have we got to do? We've got to move. Moving our bodies is good for us. Okay, so this is one that Ashley saw last spring. This is really interesting. So this graph has several different views. So let me just, we'll end on this graph. Let's go through it. So what we've got are risk factors going back this way. So 0, 1, or 2 to 3 risk factors. So what were the risk factors that they looked at that Stephen Blair, in the Journal of the American Medical Association looked at several years ago, almost 30 years ago now? Current smoker, systolic blood pressure, that's resting, greater than 140 millimeters of mercury, cholesterol greater than 240 milligrams per deciliter. So those 3 risk factors. Combined with fitness level. So this was aerobic fitness. Low, moderate, or high aerobic fitness. And then the y-axis here would be the death rate, so the mortality rate. So ideally, you would want to have a very high level of fitness with 0 risk factors. That's this square right here. So you can see this square still has a certain mortality rate, okay? But it has the lowest mortality rate. But if you look right beside it, the moderate level of fitness with 0 risk factors, the mortality rate's about the same. So what does that tell you? Do we need to be an elite endurance athlete to get benefits from exercise? No, we don't. The dose of exercise that we need to live a long time doesn't have to be what you need to get to the high fitness level. Being in the moderate fitness level, we get a huge return for our investment. So let's take a look back here. So let's take high fitness level with 2 or 3 risk factors. That's this square, this purple square right back here. Can you see this square right back there? Is it possible to have high cardiorespiratory fitness and have 2 or 3 risk factors? Oh yeah, yep, for sure. Okay, now I want you to look at that. Look at the mortality rate there, 2 or 3 risk factors. So we're talking about people with 2 or all 3 of these. Smoker, blood pressure, cholesterol, but they have a high fitness level. Compared with 0 risk factors and a low fitness level. 0 risk factors and a low fitness level. You see much difference in mortality rate there between this square and this square? So what does that suggest about the protective effects of exercise? Having a good level of fitness is protective of your health. Does that mean that you should go out and start smoking and have high blood pressure and high blood cholesterol? No. Okay? Don't go home thinking that. What the message is that we want to try to have zero risk factors, but going from low fitness to moderate fitness is where we get the greatest benefit for our health. So I think a lot of people, especially the general public, are under the impression that I've got to do all this training and I've got to put all this time investment into this to get the benefits. And it's really not true. You go from doing nothing to doing something, and you're going to get huge benefits for your health. Any questions? Okay, thank you. So I will see you on Tuesday. So we'll finish up chapter 1, and then I've got an activity for you, so try to bring your textbook.